Question 1. Market research demonstrates that many pilots seek to gain instrument flight experience as early as possible in their aviation careers. A pilot who has accumulated 50 hours of flight time in actual instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, while acting as pilot in command, PIC, believes they are sufficiently prepared to fly under instrument flight rules. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for this pilot to exercise instrument rating privileges? Option A. Log the 50 hours of IMC flight time and consider it sufficient preparation to begin flying under instrument flight rules, assuming their judgment is sound. Option B. Proceed to take the instrument rating practical test, believing the examiner will assess their overall IMC experience and deem them competent. Option C. Ask a pilot friend who has extensive instrument flight experience to endorse their logbook for instrument flight privileges. Option D. Seek training and endorsements from an authorized instructor specifically for the instrument rating, and then pass the required knowledge and practical tests. The correct answer is D. Seek training and endorsements from an authorized instructor specifically for the instrument rating, and then pass the required knowledge and practical tests. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a pilot to balance the desire to gain experience with the strict adherence to regulatory requirements for instrument rating privileges. The pilot must understand that simply accumulating flight time in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, does not automatically qualify them for the instrument rating. Specific training and endorsements are mandated by regulation. Professional judgment demands prioritizing regulatory compliance over perceived experience, as operating an aircraft in IMC without proper certification and endorsements poses significant safety risks and legal consequences. The correct approach involves diligently pursuing the specific training and endorsements required by FAR Part 61 for an instrument rating, including instrument ground and flight training from an authorized instructor, and passing the required knowledge and practical tests. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the explicit requirements of 14 CFR Section 61.65, which outlines the prerequisites for obtaining an instrument rating. Adhering to these regulations ensures the pilot possesses the necessary knowledge and skills to safely operate an aircraft solely by reference to instruments, thereby protecting the pilot, passengers, and the public. An incorrect approach would be to assume that extensive flight time in IMC, even if logged, is sufficient to exercise instrument privileges. This fails to recognize that FAR Part 61 mandates specific training content and instructor endorsements, not just time and conditions. Another incorrect approach is to rely on a friend who is a pilot, but not a certified flight instructor, CFI, or instrument instructor, to provide training or endorsements. This is a regulatory failure, because only authorized instructors can provide the required training and sign off on endorsements for instrument ratings. A further incorrect approach is to attempt to take the instrument rating practical test without the required logbook endorsements from an authorized instructor, believing that the examiner will assess their overall IMC experience. This is fundamentally flawed, as the examiner's role is to verify regulatory compliance, including the necessary endorsements, before administering the test. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding and adhering to all applicable regulations before undertaking any flight operations that require specific certifications or ratings. This involves thoroughly reviewing the relevant FARs, consulting with authorized flight instructors, and ensuring all training and endorsement requirements are met and properly documented before attempting to exercise the privileges of that rating. Question 2. Strategic planning requires a pilot operating under instrument flight rules, IFR, to anticipate and prepare for operations within various airspace classifications. Considering a flight plan that traverses areas with forecasted instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, and passes through Class A, B, C, D, and G airspace, what is the most prudent and compliant approach for the pilot to ensure safe and legal operation? Option A. Verify that the aircraft is equipped with a Mode C transponder, and that two-way radio communication capability is functional for all planned airspace, and review specific operational requirements for IFR flight in Class A, B, C, D, and G airspace, adjusting the flight plan or seeking alternative clearances as necessary based on these requirements and current weather. Option B. Focus solely on maintaining separation from known traffic and assume that ATC will provide necessary guidance for navigating through different airspace types, regardless of the aircraft's equipment or the pilot's understanding of specific airspace regulations. Option C. Proceed with the flight as planned, assuming that IFR clearance automatically grants access to all airspace and that standard VFR separation procedures will be sufficient for controlled airspace. Option D. Rely on personal weather observation and general knowledge of airspace rules, proceeding directly into the planned route without specific verification of equipment requirements or clearances for each airspace category. The correct answer is A. Verify that the aircraft is equipped with a Mode C transponder and that two-way radio communication capability is functional for all planned airspace, and review specific operational requirements for IFR flight in Class A, B, C, D, and G airspace, adjusting the flight plan or seeking alternative clearances as necessary based on these requirements and current weather. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pilot to make critical decisions regarding airspace operations under instrument flight rules, IFR, with incomplete or potentially misleading information. The pilot must prioritize safety and regulatory compliance above all else, even when faced with time pressure or the desire to reach their destination efficiently. Careful judgment is required to interpret weather reports, understand airspace classifications, and select the safest and most compliant operational strategy. The correct approach involves a thorough review of all available weather data, including forecasts and current conditions, and cross-referencing this with the specific airspace classifications along the intended route. The pilot must then determine if their instrument flight rules, IFR, clearance and aircraft equipment meet the requirements for operating in each airspace category. This includes understanding the need for two-way radio communication and a Mode C transponder in Class B, C, and E airspace, and the specific requirements for IFR operations in Class A airspace. The pilot must also consider the implications of operating in Class D and G airspace, particularly regarding VFR traffic separation and the need for appropriate clearances. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the regulatory requirements for IFR flight in all airspace classes, ensuring compliance with FAR Part 91 and any relevant FAA guidance. It prioritizes safety by ensuring the pilot has the necessary equipment, communication capabilities, and understanding of operational rules before entering each airspace. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the flight based on a general understanding of the weather and a desire to maintain the original flight plan without verifying specific airspace requirements. This fails to acknowledge the distinct operational rules for each airspace class, particularly the stringent requirements for Class A, B, and C. It also overlooks the critical need for two-way radio communication and a transponder with altitude reporting in certain airspaces, which are essential for Air Traffic Control Act to provide separation services. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because the flight is under IFR, all airspace will automatically accommodate the flight without specific checks. This ignores the fact that IFR operations in Class G airspace have different requirements than in controlled airspace, and that Class A airspace has specific altitude and equipment mandates. A further incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the pilot's personal weather interpretation without consulting official forecasts and advisories, potentially leading to misjudgment of conditions and their impact on airspace operations. Professional reasoning in such situations involves a systematic risk assessment. The pilot should first identify all potential hazards, including weather, airspace restrictions, and equipment limitations. Then, they should evaluate the likelihood and severity of each hazard. Based on this assessment, the pilot should develop and evaluate alternative courses of action, prioritizing those that minimize risk and ensure regulatory compliance. This decision-making process should always involve consulting the FAR's Aeronautical Information Manual AIM and any relevant advisory circulars. When in doubt, the pilot should always err on the side of caution, which may include delaying the flight, altering the route, or seeking guidance from ATC. Question 3. Stakeholder feedback indicates a recurring point of confusion among pilots regarding the operational definitions of VFR and IFR flight when encountering instrument meteorological conditions, IMC. A pilot has filed a VFR flight plan and is en route when they encounter conditions that meet the definition of IMC. The pilot has the necessary equipment for IFR flight and is considering whether they can continue their flight under VFR until they reach a point where they can contact air traffic control to file an IFR flight plan. Based on the regulatory framework for instrument rating airplane, which of the following best describes the pilot's immediate obligation? Option A. The pilot must immediately cease VFR flight and operate under instrument flight rules, IFR, because they are in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC. Option B. The pilot may continue VFR flight as planned until they reach a point where they can contact air traffic control to file an IFR flight plan, as the intention to file an IFR flight plan is sufficient. Option C. The pilot may continue VFR flight as planned until they reach a point where they can contact air traffic control to file an IFR flight plan, as they have the necessary equipment for IFR flight. Option D. The pilot may continue VFR flight as planned until they can contact air traffic control to file an IFR flight plan, as they initially filed a VFR flight plan. Correct answer is A. The pilot must immediately cease VFR flight and operate under instrument flight rules, IFR, because they are in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a pilot to accurately interpret and apply fundamental aviation definitions in a real-time operational context, where misinterpretation can have significant safety implications. The challenge lies in distinguishing between different operational categories and the associated regulatory requirements, particularly when transitioning between them or when ambiguity might arise. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance and maintain situational awareness. The correct approach involves a precise understanding of the definition of instrument flight rules, IFR. Flight. IFR flight is defined by the conditions under which it is conducted, specifically when operating in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, or when operating under instrument flight rules, regardless of weather. This approach correctly identifies that the pilot's intention to fly in IMC necessitates adherence to IFR, irrespective of whether they are currently operating under VFR flight plan or have filed an IFR flight plan. The regulatory framework mandates that when operating in IMC, the aircraft must be operated under IFR. An incorrect approach would be to assume that because a VFR flight plan was initially filed, the pilot can continue to operate in IMC under VFR. This fails to recognize that the operational environment, IMC, dictates the applicable rules of flight, overriding the initial flight plan filing for VFR. The regulatory framework clearly states that VFR flight is prohibited in IMC. Another incorrect approach would be to believe that simply intending to file an IFR flight plan at a later point allows for continued operation in IMC under VFR. The regulations require adherence to IFR during the period of IMC operation, not merely an intention to comply later. This approach demonstrates a misunderstanding of the immediate applicability of IFR rules when IMC is encountered. A further incorrect approach would be to consider the aircraft's equipment as the sole determinant of whether IFR rules apply. While appropriate equipment is necessary for IFR flight, the presence of equipment does not, by itself, mandate IFR operation. The decision to operate under IFR is primarily driven by the meteorological conditions and the pilot's intent to navigate using instruments. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the current meteorological conditions, the pilot's intended flight path and navigation method, and the applicable regulatory definitions. Pilots must continuously assess whether they are operating in instrument meteorological conditions. If IMC is encountered, they must immediately determine if they are operating under IFR. This involves understanding that IMC necessitates IFR operation, and any prior VFR flight plan filing becomes secondary to the immediate requirement to comply with IFR. A pilot should be prepared to transition to IFR procedures, and if necessary, amend their flight plan accordingly with air traffic control. Question 4. Benchmark analysis indicates that when conducting an instrument approach to an airport with a published procedure, a pilot must make a critical decision at the decision altitude or minimum descent altitude. Which of the following best describes the pilot's responsibility and the correct course of action if visual references are not acquired at that point? Option A. Continue descending below the decision altitude or minimum descent altitude to search for visual references, provided the weather is improving. Option B. Descend to a lower altitude than published, assuming the pilot's experience compensates for the published minimums. Option C. Immediately initiate a missed approach procedure as published, climbing to the specified altitude and following the published track or heading. Option D. Attempt to deviate from the published missed approach procedure to find a more favorable visual approach path. The correct answer is C. Immediately initiate a missed approach procedure as published, climbing to the specified altitude and following the published track or heading. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pilot to make a critical decision regarding instrument approach procedures under conditions that may deviate from standard expectations, demanding a thorough understanding of regulatory requirements and the ability to apply them judiciously. The pilot must balance the need to safely complete the approach with adherence to established procedures and the aircraft's capabilities. The correct approach involves a pilot meticulously reviewing the instrument approach procedure chart for the intended runway, paying close attention to the published minimum descent altitudes, MDA, or decision altitudes, DA, step-down fixes, and any specific notes or limitations. The pilot must then ensure that the aircraft's equipment and the pilot's proficiency are adequate to execute the approach as published, or to execute a missed approach if the required visual references are not acquired at the decision altitude or minimum descent altitude. This adheres to regulations such as 14 CFR Section 91, 175, Operations on Instrument Flight Rules, which mandates that a pilot may not descend below the applicable minimums unless specific conditions are met, and emphasizes the importance of adhering to published approach procedures and missed approach instructions. Professional judgment dictates prioritizing safety and regulatory compliance above all else. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with an approach without fully understanding or adhering to the published minimums, perhaps by descending below the MDA/DA without acquiring the necessary visual references. This directly violates 14 CFR Section 91, 175, and demonstrates a failure to exercise due diligence in ensuring a safe landing or initiating a missed approach. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt an approach with equipment that is not certified or suitable for the specific procedure, such as attempting a precision approach with only non-precision approach equipment. This disregards the limitations of the aircraft and the requirements of the approach, creating an unsafe situation and violating implicit regulatory expectations for operating within the aircraft's certified capabilities. A further incorrect approach would be to deviate from the published missed approach procedure without a clear understanding of the terrain and airspace, or to initiate a missed approach at an altitude or heading that compromises safety. This demonstrates a lack of adherence to critical safety instructions, designed to prevent controlled flight into terrain or other hazards. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, thoroughly understanding the regulatory framework governing instrument flight and approach procedures. Second, meticulously reviewing all available information, including approach charts, weather reports, and aircraft limitations. Third, assessing personal proficiency and aircraft equipment suitability for the intended operation. And finally, making a conservative decision that prioritizes safety and regulatory compliance, even if it means delaying or diverting the flight. Question 5. The assessment process reveals that during an instrument approach, a pilot observes a published altitude restriction on a chart that appears to be higher than necessary for terrain clearance based on visual cues and a general understanding of the area. The pilot considers descending below this published minimum to expedite arrival, believing there is no immediate traffic conflict. Option A. Descend below the published altitude restriction if the pilot's experience suggests it is safe and the weather conditions are favorable. Option B. Maintain the published altitude restriction or higher, and if a lower altitude is desired or required, obtain explicit clearance from air traffic control. Option C. Interpret the published altitude restriction as a guideline and descend to an altitude that feels subjectively safe based on visual observation. Option D. Descend below the published altitude restriction only after visually confirming no terrain or obstruction is present at the lower altitude. Correct answer is D. Descend below the published altitude restriction only after visually confirming no terrain or obstruction is present at the lower altitude. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pilot to make a critical decision under pressure, balancing operational efficiency with strict adherence to safety regulations. The pilot must interpret and apply altitude restrictions accurately, considering various factors that might influence their judgment. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the nuances of altitude restrictions, particularly when they are presented in different formats or contexts, and ensuring that safety is never compromised. The correct approach involves meticulously verifying the altitude restriction against the relevant aeronautical charts and operational procedures. This means understanding that published altitude restrictions are minimums designed to ensure terrain and obstruction clearance, as well as separation from other air traffic. Adhering to these minimums, or higher if specified by ATC or operational requirements, is paramount. The regulatory justification stems from the fundamental principle of ensuring safe flight operations, as mandated by aviation authorities. Specifically, regulations governing instrument flight operations, e.g., FAR Part 91 in the U.S., clearly define minimum safe altitudes and the pilot's responsibility to maintain them. Deviating from these published minimums without proper authorization or justification constitutes a serious regulatory violation and a significant safety risk. An incorrect approach would be to assume a published altitude restriction is flexible or can be bypassed based on a perceived lack of traffic or favorable weather. This demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the purpose of altitude restrictions, which are not solely for immediate traffic avoidance, but also for long-term safety margins and adherence to established airways and procedures. Such an assumption is a direct violation of regulations requiring pilots to maintain prescribed altitudes. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on a visual approximation of terrain clearance, or to interpret an altitude restriction based on a general understanding rather than the specific charted value. This bypasses the critical need for precise adherence to regulatory minimums and introduces a subjective element into a situation that demands objective compliance. The regulatory failure here is the disregard for the explicit limitations and requirements set forth in official aeronautical publications. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to prioritize speed or convenience over the mandated altitude restriction, perhaps by descending prematurely to reach a destination faster. This demonstrates a failure to prioritize safety and regulatory compliance, a core tenet of professional piloting. The ethical failure is the abdication of responsibility to ensure the safety of the flight and its occupants by choosing a less safe, non-compliant option. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify and understand all published altitude restrictions relevant to the current phase of flight. 2. Cross-reference these restrictions with current aeronautical charts and operational data. 3. Confirm any ATC instructions regarding altitude, ensuring they are understood and complied with. 4. Prioritize regulatory compliance and safety above all other considerations, including efficiency or personal convenience. 5. If there is any ambiguity or doubt regarding an altitude restriction, seek clarification from ATC or consult official documentation before proceeding. Question 6. The evaluation methodology shows that a pilot conducting an instrument approach to an airport is approaching the decision altitude (DA), and the reported visibility is at the minimum specified for the approach. However, the pilot cannot clearly discern the approach lights or runway environment due to haze. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with FAR Part 91? Option A. Continue the descent below the decision altitude, anticipating that the visibility will improve sufficiently to acquire the necessary visual references for landing. Option B. Descend below the decision altitude to a lower altitude to gain a better perspective of the runway environment before deciding whether to land or execute a missed approach. Option C. Initiate a missed approach procedure immediately upon reaching the decision altitude, as the required visual references are not yet discernible. Option D. Request an updated weather report from Air Traffic Control AC, and continue the approach if ATC reports visibility at or above the minimum. Correct answer is A. Continue the descent below the decision altitude, anticipating that the visibility will improve sufficiently to acquire the necessary visual references for landing. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pilot to balance operational efficiency with the paramount importance of safety, particularly when operating under instrument flight rules, IFR. The pilot must make a judgment call that could impact schedule and passenger comfort against the potential for an unsafe situation. Careful judgment is required to avoid complacency and to adhere strictly to regulatory requirements designed to mitigate risks in IFR operations. The correct approach involves a proactive and conservative assessment of weather conditions and aircraft performance relative to the published approach minima. This approach prioritizes safety by ensuring that the pilot has a reasonable expectation of visual contact with the required visual references for landing before descending below the decision altitude (DA) or minimum descent altitude (MDA). Specifically, it requires the pilot to be prepared to execute a missed approach if the necessary visual references are not acquired at or above the prescribed altitude. This aligns directly with FAR 91-175, which outlines the conditions under which a pilot may descend below the prescribed minimums, emphasizing the requirement for visual contact with the runway environment. An incorrect approach would be to descend below the DA/MDA based on a subjective feeling or a hope that the weather will improve sufficiently to see the runway. This disregards the explicit limitations set by the FAA for instrument approaches and introduces an unacceptable level of risk. Such an action violates the spirit and letter of FAR 91-175 by proceeding below minimums without the required visual references, potentially leading to a controlled flight into terrain or a dangerous landing in low visibility. Another incorrect approach would be to continue the approach without adequately assessing the actual weather conditions against the published minima, perhaps relying solely on ATC advisories, which are not a substitute for pilot responsibility in this regard. This fails to meet the pilot's fundamental duty to ensure the safety of the flight under IFR conditions as mandated by FAR 91-103 for flight duties and the specific requirements of FAR 91-175. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough pre-flight and in-flight assessment of all available weather information. This includes not just forecasts, but also current reports, METR, PIRP, and radar data. During the approach, the pilot must continuously monitor weather conditions and compare them against the published approach minima. If there is any doubt about acquiring the necessary visual references at the decision altitude, the pilot must be prepared to initiate a missed approach without hesitation. This proactive, conservative, and regulatory compliant mindset is crucial for safe IFR operations. Question 7. The efficiency study reveals that a pilot conducting an instrument approach to landing is consistently exceeding the maximum recommended airspeed for the final approach segment by a small margin, believing it allows for a slightly faster arrival. Which of the following actions best reflects adherence to regulatory requirements and professional piloting standards? Option A. Continue the approach at the slightly higher airspeed, as the margin of error is small and arrival time is improved. Option B. Initiate a go-around only if the airspeed exceeds the current margin of error by a significant amount. Option C. Immediately reduce airspeed to comply with the published maximum airspeed for the final approach segment. Option D. Make a subjective judgment that the current airspeed is safe given the specific conditions and continue the approach. The correct answer is C. Immediately reduce airspeed to comply with the published maximum airspeed for the final approach segment. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a pilot to balance operational efficiency with strict adherence to regulatory speed limitations during an instrument approach. The pilot must understand the purpose behind these limitations, which are designed to ensure safe operation within the aircraft's capabilities and to maintain adequate situational awareness and control margin, especially in the dynamic environment of an instrument approach. The challenge lies in interpreting the regulations and applying them to a specific operational context without compromising safety or efficiency. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to the published airspeed limitations for the instrument approach procedure. This is the only approach that guarantees compliance with the regulatory framework designed for safe instrument flight operations. The regulations, such as those found in the FAA's Instrument Procedures Handbook and FAR Part 91, specify maximum speeds for different phases of flight, including approaches, to ensure adequate stall margin, control authority, and obstacle clearance. Maintaining these speeds is paramount for predictable aircraft performance and for allowing the pilot sufficient time to react to any unforeseen circumstances or to execute a go-around if necessary. An incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over the published limitations is fundamentally flawed. This failure stems from a misunderstanding or disregard of the safety margins built into the approach design and the regulatory speed limits. By exceeding these speeds, the pilot risks reduced control authority, increased stall speed, and potentially inadequate obstacle clearance, all of which are direct violations of safety principles and regulations. Another incorrect approach that involves making subjective judgments about acceptable speed deviations, even if seemingly minor, is also unacceptable. Regulations are typically written with specific margins of safety, and allowing personal judgment to override these established limits introduces an unacceptable level of risk. This approach fails to recognize that the published limitations are not suggestions, but mandatory requirements designed to ensure a consistent and safe outcome for all instrument approaches. The professional decision-making process for such situations should involve a thorough understanding of the applicable regulation, including the specific speed limitations for the instrument approach being flown. Before commencing the approach, the pilot should review the approach chart and note the maximum permissible speeds. During the approach, continuous monitoring of airspeed against these limitations is crucial. If the aircraft is approaching or exceeding the maximum speed, the pilot must take immediate corrective action to reduce airspeed to within the prescribed limits. If corrective action is not feasible, or if the situation deteriorates, the pilot must be prepared to execute a go-around, prioritizing safety above all else. Question 8. Cost-benefit analysis shows that maintaining precise instrument recency can be time-consuming and potentially costly due to the need for specific flight activities. A pilot, preparing for an instrument flight, reviews their logbook and notes they have flown frequently in the last 6 months, including several cross-country flights in good weather. They also recall practicing some turns and climbs during these flights. Considering the regulatory framework for instrument flight recency, which of the following best represents the pilot's responsibility to ensure they are legally current for instrument flight? Option A. The pilot should rely on their general memory of flying activities and their feeling of being current to proceed with the instrument flight, as detailed logbook verification might be overly burdensome. Option B. The pilot can assume their frequent flying and practice of general maneuvers in good weather satisfies the instrument recency requirements, as it demonstrates overall piloting proficiency. Option C. The pilot should count their recent cross-country flights and general practice of turns and climbs as fulfilling the instrument recency requirements, as these activities involve navigation and aircraft control. Option D. The pilot should review their flight logbook to confirm they have completed the specific number of instrument approaches, holds, and courses or tracking by reference to instruments within the preceding 6 calendar months, as required by regulation. The correct answer is D. The pilot should review their flight logbook to confirm they have completed the specific number of instrument approaches, holds, and courses or tracking by reference to instruments within the preceding 6 calendar months, as required by regulation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a pilot to balance operational efficiency and cost-effectiveness with the absolute, non-negotiable requirement of maintaining regulatory compliance for instrument flight. The temptation to cut corners or interpret regulations loosely for perceived economic benefit is a common pitfall. Careful judgment is required to ensure that safety and legal adherence are never compromised, regardless of financial considerations. The correct approach involves a thorough and accurate assessment of recent flight experience against the specific recency requirements for instrument flight, as defined by the relevant aviation authority. This means meticulously reviewing flight logs to confirm that the pilot has completed the required number of instrument approaches, holds, and courses or tracking within the specified time frame, typically the preceding 6 months. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the regulatory framework designed to ensure pilot proficiency and safety for instrument flight operations. The regulations are in place to mitigate the inherent risks of flying in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, where visual references are absent. Maintaining recency of experience is a fundamental pillar of the safety net. An incorrect approach would be to assume that general flying experience or a recent flight in visual meteorological conditions, VMC, fulfills the instrument recency requirements. This is a regulatory failure because the regulations specifically mandate instrument experience. VMC experience does not substitute for the skills and judgment required to navigate and manage an aircraft solely by reference to instruments. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on a vague recollection or a general sense of being current, without concrete evidence from flight logs. This is both a regulatory and an ethical failure. It demonstrates a disregard for the precise requirements of the law and a potential overestimation of one's own proficiency, which can lead to unsafe operations. A third incorrect approach would be to interpret the recency period flexibly, perhaps by counting partial approaches or activities that do not fully meet the regulatory definition of a required maneuver. This is a direct violation of the regulations and a dangerous misinterpretation of safety standards. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance above all else when it comes to safety-critical areas like recency of experience. This involves maintaining meticulous records, regularly reviewing them against current regulations, and seeking clarification from regulatory bodies or qualified instructors when in doubt. The cost-benefit analysis should always weigh the potential cost of noncompliance accidents, fines, license suspension, against the perceived benefits of expediency. In this context, the cost of ensuring compliance is always far lower than the potential cost of failing to do so. Question 9. Market research demonstrates that pilots often face time pressures during pre-departure checks. Considering the critical nature of instrument departures, which of the following actions best reflects a pilot's responsibility when preparing for an instrument departure from an airport with published departure procedures? Option A. Review the instrument approach procedure chart and any associated departure procedure, DP, or obstacle departure procedure, OD, to understand all published altitudes, headings, and clearances, and ensure aircraft performance meets these requirements before initiating the departure. Option B. Rely solely on ATC instructions for the departure, assuming they will always account for all terrain and obstacle clearance requirements without the need for pilot cross-verification. Option C. Deviate from the published departure procedure if a perceived more efficient route is identified, without explicit ATC clearance or a detailed assessment of obstacle clearance. Option D. Assume a standard departure path based on previous flights from the same airport, as ATC will provide necessary guidance. The correct answer is A. Review the instrument approach procedure chart and any associated departure procedure, DP, or obstacle departure procedure, OD, to understand all published altitudes, headings, and clearances, and ensure aircraft performance meets these requirements before initiating the departure. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pilot to balance immediate operational needs with strict adherence to regulatory requirements for departure procedures. The pilot must make a critical decision under potential time pressure, where a deviation from standard procedures could compromise safety or lead to regulatory noncompliance. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any chosen departure method is both safe and legally permissible. The correct approach involves meticulously reviewing the instrument approach procedure chart and the associated departure procedure, DP, or obstacle departure procedure, OD, for the intended departure. This includes understanding the specific altitudes, headings, and clearances required by the DP/ODP, and ensuring the aircraft's performance capabilities meet these requirements. The pilot must then brief the crew, if applicable, and ATC on the intended departure, confirming compliance with all published restrictions. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the regulatory framework for instrument departures, prioritizing safety by ensuring obstacle clearance and adherence to air traffic control instructions. Specifically, adherence to published DPs and ODPs is mandated by regulations such as 14 CFR 91, 175C, and 14 CFR 91, 177, which require pilots to follow published procedures for instrument departures to ensure safe terrain and obstacle clearance. An incorrect approach would be to assume a standard departure path without consulting the published procedure. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the critical safety net provided by DPs and ODPs, which are designed to account for specific terrain and obstacle hazards in the departure path. Such an assumption violates the pilot's responsibility to operate safely and in accordance with published procedures, potentially leading to a loss of terrain or obstacle clearance, and a violation of 14 CFR 91, 175C. Another incorrect approach would be to deviate from the published DP or ODP based on a pilot's personal experience or a perceived shortcut without explicit clearance from Air Traffic Control Act. and a thorough understanding of the implications for obstacle clearance. This is professionally unacceptable, as it undermines the established safety procedures and the authority of ATC. Deviating without proper authorization and assessment of the risks is a direct contravention of regulatory requirements and a significant safety failure. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on ATC instructions for departure without cross-referencing them with the published DP or ODP, especially if the ATC instruction appears to conflict with or deviate from the published procedure. While ATC clearance is paramount, pilots have a responsibility to ensure that any instructions received do not compromise their ability to maintain safe terrain and obstacle clearance, particularly in the context of instrument departures. Failure to verify the safety and regulatory compliance of ATC instructions in relation to published departure procedures can lead to unsafe situations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a systematic approach. First, thoroughly review all relevant charts and publications, including DPs, ODP, and airport diagrams, for the intended departure. Second, assess aircraft performance against the requirements of the published procedure. Third, brief the departure procedure clearly. Fourth, communicate with ATC, confirming understanding of clearances and reporting any potential conflicts or concerns regarding the published procedure. Finally, always prioritize safety and regulatory compliance, even if it means delaying or diverting the operation. Question 10. The control framework reveals that an aircraft is cleared for an instrument departure from an airport where a published obstacle departure procedure, ODP, exists, but the pilot is considering an alternative climb path based on their visual assessment of terrain and a general understanding of their aircraft's climb performance. What is the most appropriate and regulatory compliant course of action? Option A. Depart without a clear understanding of the required climb gradient or published procedure, proceeding on a general assumption of safety. Option B. Construct a non-standard departure path based on a quick mental calculation of climb performance and visual cues. Option C. Proceed with a visual climb over visible obstacles, assuming the aircraft's climb performance is adequate to clear them. Option D. Strictly adhere to the published obstacle departure procedure, ODP, or, in its absence, a standard instrument departure SID that incorporates obstacle clearance criteria, or if neither is published, adhere to the minimum climb gradient specified in regulations for obstacle clearance. Correct answer is D. Strictly adhere to the published obstacle departure procedure, ODP, or, in its absence, a standard instrument departure SID that incorporates obstacle clearance criteria, or if neither is published, adhere to the minimum climb gradient specified in regulations for obstacle clearance. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pilot to make a critical decision regarding obstacle clearance during departure, directly impacting safety. The pilot must balance the immediate need to depart with the imperative to adhere to established procedures designed to ensure a safe climb path over obstacles. Misinterpreting or deviating from these procedures can lead to catastrophic outcomes. Careful judgment is required to assess the available information and select the safest course of action. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to the published obstacle departure procedure, ODP, or, in its absence, a standard instrument departure SID that incorporates obstacle clearance criteria, or if neither is published, adhering to the minimum climb gradient specified in regulations for obstacle clearance. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the regulatory mandate to ensure safe obstacle clearance during departure. Regulations, such as those found in the FAA's Instrument Procedures Handbook or equivalent National Aviation Authority guidance, explicitly detail the requirements for obstacle clearance on departure. These procedures are designed and validated to provide a safe margin above all known obstacles within a specified area. Deviating from these published procedures without a thorough understanding of the implications and regulatory allowances is a direct violation of safety standards. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a visual climb over obstacles is sufficient, even if the pilot believes they can see them. This is incorrect because visual perception can be unreliable, especially in varying weather conditions, and it does not account for obstacles that may be obscured or beyond the pilot's immediate line of sight. Furthermore, it bypasses the established, certified obstacle clearance criteria. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to construct a non-standard departure path based on a quick mental calculation of climb performance. This is incorrect because it lacks the rigorous analysis and validation that goes into published ODPs and SIDs, and it introduces a high risk of inadequate obstacle clearance due to potential miscalculations or overlooking critical factors. Finally, electing to depart without a clear understanding of the required climb gradient or published procedure and proceeding on a guess is fundamentally unsafe and a direct contravention of regulatory requirements for instrument departures. Professional decision-making in such situations should involve a systematic process. First, thoroughly review the departure procedure in the relevant aeronautical charts and publications. If an ODP or SID is published, understand its requirements and limitations. If no ODP or SID is published, determine the required climb gradient for obstacle clearance based on regulatory guidance. If there is any ambiguity, or if the aircraft's performance does not meet the required climb gradient under anticipated conditions, the pilot must not depart until the situation is rectified, which may involve delaying the flight, filing a different route, or obtaining specific clearance from air traffic control. Question 11. Quality control measures reveal a recurring pattern where pilots, when issued an altitude assignment that is slightly different from their current altitude and not immediately actionable due to aircraft performance, sometimes proceed with the new altitude without explicitly confirming the exact clearance with air traffic control. This practice is observed in situations where the pilot believes they understand the controller's intent. Option A. Immediately request clarification from air traffic control to confirm the precise altitude assignment and the expected rate of climb or descent. Option B. Continue with the current altitude and heading, waiting for the controller to reissue the instruction with more specificity. Option C. Proceed with the altitude assignment, assuming the controller is aware of the aircraft's performance limitations and will adjust if necessary. Option D. Interpret the instruction as a suggestion and adjust the altitude at the pilot's discretion when convenient. The correct answer is A. Immediately request clarification from air traffic control to confirm the precise altitude assignment and the expected rate of climb or descent. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in aviation where precise communication is paramount for safety. The professional challenge lies in interpreting and responding to controller instructions when terminology might be ambiguous or when a pilot's understanding might differ from the controller's intent, especially under pressure. Careful judgment is required to ensure adherence to regulations while maintaining situational awareness and safety. The correct approach involves a pilot actively seeking clarification when an instruction is unclear, particularly when it pertains to critical aspects of flight, such as altitude or heading. This proactive communication aligns with the fundamental principles of air traffic control and pilot responsibilities, emphasizing mutual understanding and the avoidance of errors. Specifically, the pilot/controller glossary, as defined by regulatory frameworks like the FAA's Aeronautical Information Manual AIM, provides standardized definitions for aviation terms. When a pilot is unsure of a controller's instruction, referencing or seeking clarification based on these standardized definitions is the safest and most compliant course of action. This ensures that both parties are operating with the same understanding of critical clearances and instructions, thereby preventing deviations from intended flight paths or altitudes, which could lead to hazardous situations. An incorrect approach would be to assume the meaning of an ambiguous instruction. This bypasses the established safety protocols for communication and relies on guesswork, which is inherently risky in aviation. The regulatory framework mandates clear and concise communication, and when this is lacking, the responsibility falls on both pilot and controller to resolve the ambiguity. Failing to seek clarification directly violates the principle of ensuring mutual understanding and could lead to a violation of airspace rules or a loss of separation. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with an action based on a potentially misunderstood instruction without confirming. This demonstrates a lack of adherence to the safety-first principle and a disregard for the established communication procedures designed to prevent errors. The regulatory expectation is for pilots to be vigilant and to confirm any instruction that could be misinterpreted, especially when it involves critical flight parameters. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to ignore the instruction altogether, assuming it was a mistake or not intended for the pilot. This is a severe dereliction of duty. Air traffic control instructions are authoritative and must be addressed. If there is doubt about the instruction's applicability or clarity, the pilot must communicate this doubt to the controller, not simply disregard it. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a systematic approach. First, listen carefully to the instruction. Second, if any part of the instruction is unclear or could be interpreted in multiple ways, immediately request clarification from the controller, referencing the specific part of the instruction that is in doubt. Third, confirm understanding of the corrected or clarified instruction before executing it. This process prioritizes safety, regulatory compliance, and effective communication. Question 12. The performance metrics show that the aircraft is capable of maintaining altitude and heading with minimal deviation during simulated instrument conditions. But a review of the aircraft's equipment list reveals that only a basic set of flight instruments is installed. Considering the need to operate under instrument flight rules, IFR, in the near future, which of the following actions best ensures compliance with regulatory requirements for instrument flight? Option A. Proceed with the instrument flight, assuming that the aircraft's general flight characteristics are sufficient for safe operation in instrument meteorological conditions. Option B. Confirm that the aircraft is equipped with all instruments and navigation equipment mandated by the relevant aviation authority for instrument flight, and that these are properly documented as installed and functional. Option C. Obtain a verbal confirmation from the aircraft owner that the aircraft is generally equipped for instrument flight, without independently verifying specific equipment or documentation. Option D. Rely on the pilot's personal experience and skill to compensate for any missing or non-certified instrument equipment during the instrument flight. The correct answer is B. Confirm that the aircraft is equipped with all instruments and navigation equipment mandated by the relevant aviation authority for instrument flight, and that these are properly documented as installed and functional. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pilot to reconcile operational needs with stringent regulatory requirements for instrument flight. The pilot must make a critical judgment call regarding the airworthiness and legality of operating in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, based on the aircraft's installed equipment. Failure to comply with these requirements can lead to unsafe flight operations, regulatory penalties, and potential loss of privileges. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all mandatory equipment for IFR flight is present, functional, and properly documented, even when faced with operational pressures. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the aircraft's equipment list against the specific requirements for instrument flight operations as mandated by the relevant aviation authority. This includes verifying the presence and operational status of instruments such as the attitude indicator, heading indicator, VOR, ILS, ADF, if applicable, and DME, if applicable, as well as navigation and communication radios. The pilot must also ensure that the aircraft's maintenance records reflect the proper installation and certification of this equipment. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the regulatory framework governing instrument flight, ensuring the aircraft is legally equipped and safe for the intended operation. The regulatory justification lies in the explicit requirements for IFR aircraft equipment, designed to provide the pilot with the necessary information to maintain spatial orientation and navigate safely in conditions of reduced visibility. An incorrect approach would be to assume that because the aircraft is generally capable of flight, it is automatically equipped for instrument flight. This overlooks the specific, often detailed, equipment mandates for IFR operations. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the aircraft's general appearance or a pilot's personal experience, without verifying against the official equipment list and maintenance records. This bypasses the critical step of regulatory compliance and objective verification. A further incorrect approach would be to proceed with the flight based on a verbal assurance from a mechanic or previous pilot, without independent confirmation of the equipment's presence and certification. This demonstrates a failure to exercise due diligence and a disregard for the established safety and regulatory protocols. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that prioritizes regulatory compliance and safety. This involves 1. Identifying the intended flight operation e.g., VFR IFR. 2. Consulting the relevant regulatory authorities' documentation for specific equipment requirements for that operation. 3. Verifying the aircraft's installed equipment against these requirements, referencing the aircraft's flight manual and maintenance records. 4. Ensuring all required equipment is functional and properly documented. 5. If any discrepancies exist, addressing them before commencing the flight. This process ensures that operational decisions are grounded in regulatory mandates and safety best practices. Question 13. The performance metrics show a consistent pattern of excellent instrument flight proficiency for Captain Eva Rostova. However, she recently received a diagnosis of a new-onset medical condition that may affect her cognitive function and reaction time. She is concerned about how this diagnosis might impact her ability to maintain her FAA first-class medical certificate, which is required for her instrument rating. She has not yet discussed this with an aviation medical examiner, AIM. What is the most appropriate course of action for Captain Rostova to ensure compliance with aviation regulations and maintain her instrument privileges? Option A. Rely on her personal assessment of her ability to perform instrument flight duties, believing her extensive experience will compensate for any potential subtle cognitive changes. Option B. Continue flying under her current medical certificate until her next scheduled medical examination, assuming the condition is not immediately debilitating. Option C. Research online forums and pilot groups to find anecdotal evidence from other pilots with similar conditions and follow their advice regarding continued flight. Option D. Immediately cease all flight operations, including those requiring an instrument rating, and schedule an appointment with an aviation medical examiner, AIM, to discuss her diagnosis and its implications for her medical certificate. The correct answer is B. Continue flying under her current medical certificate until her next scheduled medical examination, assuming the condition is not immediately debilitating. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a pilot to navigate a situation where a medical condition could potentially impact their ability to safely operate an aircraft under instrument flight rules, which demand a higher level of cognitive function and physical capability due to reliance on instruments rather than visual cues. The pilot must make a judgment call that balances their personal desire to fly with their absolute responsibility for the safety of their passengers and the public. This requires a thorough understanding of regulatory requirements and a commitment to ethical aviation practices. Correct approach involves proactively addressing the potential medical disqualification by consulting with an aviation medical examiner, AIM, and understanding the process for obtaining a statement of demonstrated ability, SOTA, if applicable. This demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and safety. By seeking guidance from an AME, the pilot ensures they are operating within the bounds of their medical certificate and any potential limitations or waivers, thereby upholding the highest standards of aviation safety and professional responsibility. This proactive stance is crucial for maintaining an instrument rating, which is predicated on the pilot's sustained medical fitness. An incorrect approach would be to continue flying without disclosing the condition or seeking appropriate medical evaluation. This failure to comply with medical certification requirements is a direct violation of aviation regulations. It creates a significant safety risk, as the pilot may be experiencing symptoms that impair their judgment, reaction time, or overall ability to safely control the aircraft, especially in the demanding environment of instrument flight. Furthermore, it constitutes a breach of trust with the regulatory authority and the flying public. Another incorrect approach is to assume the condition is minor and will not affect flight performance without professional medical assessment. This assumption bypasses the regulatory requirement for medical certification and the critical role of an AME in determining fitness to fly. It prioritizes personal convenience over safety and regulatory adherence, which is fundamentally contrary to the principles of professional aviation. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Recognizing a potential issue that may affect medical certification. 2. Immediately consulting the relevant aviation medical authority or a designated aviation medical examiner. 3. Understanding the specific regulatory requirements for medical certificates and any associated waivers or special considerations. 4. Adhering strictly to the guidance provided by the AME and regulatory bodies. 5. Prioritizing safety and regulatory compliance above all else, even if it means temporarily or permanently grounding oneself. Question 14. What factors determine an instrument-rated pilot's eligibility and authorization to operate an airplane in Class A airspace? Option A. The presence of an autopilot system and the pilot's experience in high-altitude flight. Option B. The aircraft's ability to maintain a specific altitude and the pilot's familiarity with the intended route. Option C. The aircraft's IFR equipment, current airworthiness certificate, and a specific air traffic control clearance. Option D, the pilot's total flight hours and general IFR proficiency. Correct answer is C, the aircraft's IFR equipment, current airworthiness certificate, and a specific air traffic control clearance. Explanation: scenario analysis. Navigating Class A airspace presents a unique professional challenge for instrument-rated pilots due to its stringent operational requirements and the absence of visual meteorological conditions, VMC. The primary challenge lies in ensuring absolute compliance with all regulatory mandates, as deviations can have severe safety implications and lead to significant enforcement actions. Pilots must possess a thorough understanding of the specific equipment, certification, and operational procedures required for this airspace, demanding a high level of pre-flight planning and in-flight vigilance. The absence of visual references necessitates complete reliance on instruments and air traffic control (AC) clearances, making any misinterpretation or oversight potentially catastrophic. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a pilot meticulously verifying that their aircraft is equipped with the required navigation and communication equipment, that the aircraft has a current and appropriate airworthiness certificate for operations in Class A airspace, and that they have obtained a proper ATC clearance before entering. This approach is correct because Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, 14 CFR, Part 91, 131, explicitly mandates that to operate in Class A airspace, an aircraft must be equipped with an Instrument Flight Rules, IFR, instrument and navigation equipment appropriate to the aircraft and the air traffic control system. Furthermore, 14 CFR Part 91, 131b, 1 requires that the pilot must have received an ATC clearance specifying the altitude and route to be flown. This comprehensive verification ensures adherence to the foundational safety and regulatory pillars for operating in this demanding airspace. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that relies solely on the pilot's experience and a general understanding of IFR procedures without specific verification of equipment and clearance is incorrect. This fails to meet the explicit requirements of 14 CFR Part 91, 131, which mandates specific equipment and ATC authorization. It represents a significant regulatory failure by neglecting the detailed stipulations for Class A operations. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that if an aircraft is capable of IFR flight, it is automatically authorized for Class A airspace. This is a critical misunderstanding of the regulatory framework. Class A airspace has specific entry requirements beyond general IFR capability, including the need for a clearance and appropriate equipment as detailed in 14 CFR Part 91, 131. Finally, an approach that prioritizes speed of entry into Class A airspace over obtaining a confirmed ATC clearance is fundamentally flawed and dangerous. 14 CFR Part 91, 131b, 1 makes obtaining an ATC clearance a prerequisite for entry. Proceeding without one is a direct violation and creates an uncontrolled and hazardous situation within a highly regulated environment. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation must adopt a systematic checklist-driven approach. This involves 1. Pre-flight planning, thoroughly reviewing aircraft equipment logs and airworthiness directives against the requirements of 14 CFR Part 91, 131. 2. Communication, actively seeking and confirming ATC clearance, ensuring all details, altitude, route, transponder code are understood and acknowledged. 3. In-flight monitoring, continuously verifying aircraft systems and adherence to ATC instructions. This disciplined process minimizes the risk of regulatory noncompliance and enhances safety by ensuring all parties are operating within the established framework of Class A airspace operations. Question 15. Examination of the data shows that a pilot operating under Instrument Flight Rules IFR is en route to an airport with a forecast of marginal weather conditions that are predicted to deteriorate further. The pilot has sufficient fuel to reach the destination with the required reserve, but the destination airport's weather is currently at the minimums for approach and is forecast to drop below those minimums shortly after the estimated time of arrival. The pilot has not yet identified or confirmed a suitable alternate airport. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Continue towards the destination airport, closely monitoring weather updates, and plan to divert if conditions deteriorate significantly before arrival. Option B. Immediately request a deviation to a pre-identified and suitable alternate airport that is within fuel range. Option C. Request an expedited approach clearance to the destination airport to arrive before the weather deteriorates below minimums. Option D. Proceed to the destination airport as planned, assuming the forecast may be overly conservative and the weather might remain within limits. The correct answer is A. Continue towards the destination airport, closely monitoring weather updates, and plan to divert if conditions deteriorate significantly before arrival. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pilot to balance the immediate need for timely arrival with the paramount importance of safety, especially when operating under instrument flight rules, IFR, in potentially deteriorating weather conditions. The pilot must make a critical judgment call based on incomplete or evolving information, adhering strictly to regulatory mandates designed to prevent accidents during special flight operations. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of all available information, including current and forecast weather, aircraft performance capabilities, and available alternate airports, before committing to a specific course of action. This proactive and conservative stance prioritizes safety by ensuring that contingency plans are in place and that the flight can be conducted within safe operational parameters. Specifically, the pilot must consult the latest weather reports and forecasts, consider the aircraft's fuel reserves, and identify suitable alternate airports that meet regulatory requirements for IFR operations. This aligns with the fundamental principles of IFR flight, which emphasize maintaining situational awareness and having a plan for unforeseen circumstances. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the flight based on optimistic assumptions or a desire to meet a schedule without a comprehensive risk assessment. This could involve disregarding marginal weather conditions, assuming forecasts will improve, or failing to adequately plan for diversions. Such actions directly contravene regulations that mandate pilots to be proficient, to ensure the aircraft is airworthy, and to operate safely, particularly in special flight operations where risks are inherently higher. Ignoring updated weather information or not having a viable alternate airport constitutes a failure to exercise due diligence and a disregard for the established safety protocols designed to prevent loss of control or controlled flight into terrain. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with gathering all relevant data, followed by a systematic evaluation of risks and potential outcomes. This includes consulting regulatory guidance, aircraft operating manuals, and weather services. When faced with uncertainty, the professional pilot should err on the side of caution, prioritizing safety over schedule. This involves clear communication with air traffic control and, if necessary, delaying or diverting the flight. Question 16. When evaluating a situation where a minor, non-incident causing deviation from standard operating procedures occurred during an instrument flight, and the pilot is considering reporting it, which approach best aligns with the principles and intent of the Aviation Safety Reporting Program, ASAP, for fostering a proactive safety culture? Option A. Consider the deviation minor and therefore not worthy of reporting, as it did not impact the safety of the flight. Option B. Discuss the deviation informally with other pilots without making a formal report. Option C. Report the deviation through the Aviation Safety Reporting Program, ASAP, to contribute to systemic safety analysis. Option D. Report the deviation solely through internal company channels that do not offer the same protections as ASAP. The correct answer is C. Report the deviation through the Aviation Safety Reporting Program, ASAP, to contribute to systemic safety analysis. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pilot to balance the immediate need for operational safety with the long-term benefits of reporting potential system vulnerabilities. The pilot must make a judgment call on how to best contribute to aviation safety without compromising their immediate responsibilities or facing undue personal repercussions. Careful consideration of the Aviation Safety Reporting Program, ASAP guidelines, and the pilot's ethical obligations is paramount. The correct approach involves proactively reporting the event through the ASAP, even though the immediate flight was not compromised. This aligns with the core purpose of ASAP, which is to encourage voluntary reporting of safety information, to identify and correct hazards before they lead to accidents. By reporting, the pilot contributes to a systemic safety improvement, which is the ultimate goal of such programs. This approach demonstrates a commitment to the broader aviation safety culture and leverages the protections offered by the ASAP. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the event as minor and not report it. This fails to recognize that even seemingly small deviations can indicate underlying systemic issues or potential future hazards. Ethically, it represents a missed opportunity to contribute to collective safety knowledge. Another incorrect approach would be to report the event only through official channels that do not offer the same level of confidentiality and protection as ASAP. This might lead to disciplinary action or a reluctance to report in the future, undermining the spirit of voluntary reporting and potentially hindering the identification of systemic safety issues. A further incorrect approach would be to discuss the event informally with colleagues without formal reporting. While this might provide some peer support, it does not contribute to the formal safety data collection and analysis that ASAP facilitates, and it misses the opportunity for systemic correction and potential immunity. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety culture and the principles of voluntary reporting. This involves understanding the purpose and benefits of programs like ASAP, assessing the potential safety implications of an event, and choosing the reporting mechanism that best serves the overall goal of aviation safety while adhering to ethical obligations and regulatory guidance. Question 17. Stakeholder feedback indicates that during pre-flight briefings, pilots sometimes encounter unfamiliar abbreviations in NOTAM and weather reports. A pilot reviewing a NOTAM for an airport of intended landing sees the abbreviation ADF. While the pilot has some familiarity with aviation acronyms, they are unsure of the precise meaning of ADF in this specific context and its potential impact on their instrument approach. Which of the following represents the most professionally sound and regulatory compliant approach to address this situation? Option A. Ask a fellow pilot for their interpretation of ADF without verifying it against official documentation. Option B. Assume ADF refers to a common navigational aid and proceed with the flight, relying on general knowledge of such systems. Option C. Consult an official, up-to-date FAA Aeronautical Information Manual AIM, or a reputable aviation abbreviation reference guide to determine the precise meaning of ADF and its implications for the intended approach before proceeding. Option D. Ignore the abbreviation, assuming it is not critical to the immediate flight operations and will become apparent during the approach. The correct answer is C. Consult an official, up-to-date FAA Aeronautical Information Manual AIM, or a reputable aviation abbreviation reference guide to determine the precise meaning of ADF and its implications for the intended approach before proceeding. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pilot to interpret and apply potentially ambiguous or incomplete information under pressure, directly impacting flight safety. The correct understanding and application of aviation abbreviations are critical for accurate communication, situational awareness, and adherence to procedures. Misinterpreting an abbreviation can lead to incorrect decisions with severe consequences. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of standard aviation abbreviations as defined by the relevant regulatory authority. In this case, the FAA for U.S.-based operations. This includes knowing the meaning of common abbreviations found in aeronautical information publications, APE, NOTAM, charts, and aircraft manuals. When faced with an unfamiliar abbreviation, the professional pilot will consult official, authoritative sources to ensure correct interpretation before taking action. This aligns with the FAA's emphasis on pilot proficiency and adherence to regulations, which implicitly require accurate comprehension of all flight-related information. An incorrect approach would be to guess the meaning of an abbreviation based on context or prior, potentially outdated, knowledge. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the established safety protocols for information dissemination and comprehension. The FAA regulations, such as those pertaining to instrument flight rules, e.g., 14 CFR Part 91, mandate that pilots operate with a thorough understanding of all information pertinent to the safe conduct of the flight. Relying on assumptions rather than verified definitions directly violates this principle of due diligence and can lead to noncompliance with operational procedures or airspace restrictions. Another incorrect approach is to ignore an unfamiliar abbreviation, assuming it is not critical to the immediate flight operation. This is a failure of professional responsibility. All information provided by air traffic control, NOTAM, or other official sources is deemed important for flight safety until confirmed otherwise through official channels. Ignoring such information creates a blind spot in situational awareness, potentially leading to hazardous situations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach to information processing. First, pilots must maintain a current knowledge base of standard aviation abbreviations. Second, when encountering an unfamiliar abbreviation, they should prioritize seeking clarification from the source, e.g., air traffic control, or consulting an official, up-to-date reference manual or publication. Third, if immediate clarification is not possible and the information appears critical, the pilot should err on the side of caution, potentially delaying the operation or requesting alternative instructions until the information is definitively understood. This proactive and safety-oriented approach ensures compliance and mitigates risk. Question 18. Benchmark analysis indicates that pilots preparing for their instrument rating practical test often face challenges in accurately documenting and verifying their aeronautical experience. A pilot has logged numerous hours of flight time, including cross-country flights, flights in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, and practice instrument approaches. Which approach best ensures compliance with the aeronautical experience requirements outlined in Federal Aviation Regulations, FAR, Part 61 for an instrument rating? Option A. Systematically review all logged flight time, categorizing each flight segment according to the specific definitions and requirements for cross-country flight, instrument approaches, and instrument time as detailed in FAR 61. 65. And cross-reference this against personal flight logs. Option B. Assume that all logged flight time, particularly flights conducted in IMC, will count towards the instrument rating requirements, as the pilot was operating under instrument flight rules. Option C. Count only those flight hours that were specifically designated and logged as instrument training during dual instruction, excluding any instrument experience gained during solo cross-country flights or other operational flights. Option D. Rely solely on the flight instructor's confirmation that the pilot has accumulated sufficient flight hours, without independently verifying the specific categories of aeronautical experience against the FARs. The correct answer is A. Systematically review all logged flight time, categorizing each flight segment according to the specific definitions and requirements for cross-country flight, instrument approaches, and instrument time as detailed in FAR 61. 65. And cross-reference this against personal flight logs. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge for pilots pursuing an instrument rating, interpreting and applying the specific aeronautical experience requirements outlined in FAR Part 61. The challenge lies in accurately categorizing flight time and ensuring all regulatory prerequisites are met before attempting the practical test. Misinterpreting these requirements can lead to significant delays, additional training, and potential issues with the FAA. Professional judgment is required to meticulously review flight logs and cross-reference them with the FARs to avoid inadvertent noncompliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of all logged flight time, specifically identifying and categorizing cross-country flights, instrument approaches, and instrument time in accordance with FAR 61. 65. This meticulous cross-referencing ensures that each logged hour directly contributes to meeting the specific requirements for instrument rating aeronautical experience. The justification is rooted in strict adherence to the regulatory text of FAR 61. 65, which mandates specific types and durations of flight experience. By systematically verifying each component against the regulation, the pilot demonstrates due diligence and ensures they are fully compliant. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that all logged flight time counts towards the instrument rating requirements without specific categorization. This fails to acknowledge that FAR 61. 65 has distinct requirements for cross-country flight time, instrument approaches, and instrument time, which cannot be arbitrarily substituted. The regulatory failure is the disregard for the specificity of the requirements. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on a flight instructor's verbal assurance that the requirements are met without independent verification. A flight instructor's guidance is invaluable. The ultimate responsibility for meeting the regulatory prerequisites rests with the pilot. This approach risks overlooking subtle nuances or specific interpretations of the FARs, leading to a regulatory failure of self-accountability. A third incorrect approach is to only count flight time that was explicitly planned for instrument training. This overlooks the possibility that legitimate instrument experience may have been gained during cross-country flights or other operations where instrument conditions were encountered and appropriate procedures were followed, as long as the flight meets the definition of instrument flight time or instrument approach procedures as defined in the FARs. The regulatory failure here is a narrow interpretation that excludes potentially valid aeronautical experience. Professional reasoning. Professionals in aviation must cultivate a habit of meticulous record-keeping and regulatory cross-referencing. When pursuing a certificate or rating, the decision-making process should involve 1. Obtaining the relevant FARs, in this case, FAR Part 61. 2. Carefully reviewing the specific aeronautical experience requirements for the desired rating. 3. Systematically analyzing personal flight logs, categorizing each flight segment according to the FAR definitions. 4. Cross-referencing the log time against each specific requirement. 5. Seeking clarification from a qualified instructor or FAA representative if any ambiguity exists. This systematic and proactive approach minimizes the risk of non-compliance and ensures a smooth progression towards certification. Question 19. Regulatory review indicates that a pilot operating under Instrument Flight Rules (IFR) is en route to an airport located within Class A airspace. The pilot is currently in VMC and has a clear view of the destination airport. The pilot has not yet received an IFR clearance for Class A airspace. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action? Option A. Maintain current course and altitude until reaching the boundary of Class A airspace, then contact ATC for clearance. Option B. Deviate from the current course to enter Class E or G airspace where an IFR clearance is not required for visual flight. Option C. Continue the flight directly to the destination airport, as VMC allows for visual navigation and the pilot can see the airport. Option D. Immediately contact Air Traffic Control (ATC) to request an IFR clearance for Class A airspace while continuing on the current course. Correct answer is C. Continue the flight directly to the destination airport, as VMC allows for visual navigation and the pilot can see the airport. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the pilot's responsibility to maintain situational awareness and adhere to airspace regulations, especially when faced with unexpected conditions. The ethical dimension arises from the pilot's duty to ensure the safety of flight for themselves, their passengers, and other airspace users, which supersedes personal convenience or the desire to complete a flight on schedule. Careful judgment is required to balance operational efficiency with strict adherence to regulatory requirements. The correct approach involves prioritizing compliance with the established Instrument Flight Rules (IFR) procedures for Class A airspace. This means ensuring the aircraft is properly equipped with the required navigation and communication equipment, that the pilot is current and qualified for IFR flight, and that a clearance is obtained from Air Traffic Control (ATC) before entering Class A airspace. This approach is ethically and regulatorily sound because Class A airspace is designated for IFR operations only, with stringent separation standards maintained by ATC. Operating without a clearance or proper equipment would violate FAR 91, 131 and FAR 91, 155, jeopardizing safety and potentially leading to a loss of separation with other IFR traffic. An incorrect approach would be to assume that because the weather is clear and the pilot has visual meteorological conditions, VMC, they can proceed into Class A airspace without an IFR clearance. This fails to recognize that Class A airspace is exclusively for IFR operations, regardless of current weather. The regulatory failure here is a direct violation of FAR 91, 131, which mandates ATC clearance for entry. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for the established safety protocols designed to manage high-speed, high-altitude IFR traffic. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to contact ATC for a clearance only after entering Class A airspace. This is also a regulatory failure as it places ATC in a difficult position, potentially requiring them to rapidly establish separation with existing traffic. It also bypasses the requirement for pre-entry clearance, as outlined in FAR 91, 131. Ethically, It shows a lack of foresight and respect for the air traffic system. A third incorrect approach would be to descend into Class E or G airspace to avoid the need for an IFR clearance, even if the intended destination is within Class A. While descending into VMC in lower airspace might be permissible under certain conditions, if the pilot's intended flight path and destination are in Class A, this maneuver is a deviation from the planned IFR operation and could lead to a loss of situational awareness or an unplanned encounter with other traffic. The regulatory failure lies in not adhering to the planned IFR route and potentially operating in a manner inconsistent with the purpose of the IFR flight plan. Ethically, it suggests an attempt to circumvent regulations rather than operate within them. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough pre-flight briefing of airspace requirements and a continuous assessment of the flight environment. Pilots should always anticipate potential weather changes and understand the implications for airspace operations. When encountering unexpected conditions or needing to operate in controlled airspace, the primary focus must be on obtaining the necessary clearances and ensuring all regulatory requirements are met before entering the airspace. If unable to comply with the regulations for a particular airspace, the pilot must alter their flight plan or route to remain in compliant airspace. Question 20. Process analysis reveals a pilot holding an instrument rating for airplanes is planning a flight that will likely encounter instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, for a significant portion of the route. The pilot has not flown in IMC for several months and has not completed the required recent instrument experience to act as pilot in command PIC under IFR. The pilot is considering proceeding with the flight, believing their instrument rating is sufficient and that they can manage the conditions, which approach best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional pilot responsibility. Option A. Postpone the flight until the pilot can complete the required recent instrument experience or obtain a proficiency check. Option B. Attempt to fly the route at a higher altitude where VMC conditions might be present, even if it deviates significantly from the planned flight path. Option C. Proceed with the flight, relying on the instrument rating and the aircraft's advanced navigation systems to manage the conditions. Option D. Proceed with the flight but request an IFR clearance and advise air traffic control of the pilot's limited recent instrument experience. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the flight, relying on the instrument rating and the aircraft's advanced navigation systems to manage the conditions. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a pilot to make a critical judgment call regarding their privileges and limitations under instrument flight rules, IFR, in a dynamic weather situation. The pilot must accurately assess their current proficiency, the aircraft's capabilities, and the specific limitations imposed by their instrument rating to ensure safe operation. Misinterpreting these limitations can lead to a loss of situational awareness, compromised aircraft control, and potentially a dangerous flight path. The correct approach involves the pilot recognizing that their instrument rating, while allowing flight in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, is subject to specific limitations and currency requirements. The pilot must proactively assess if they meet all the necessary prerequisites for the intended flight, including recent instrument experience as mandated by regulations. If there is any doubt about meeting these requirements, the pilot must err on the side of caution and either postpone the flight, alter the route to remain in visual meteorological conditions, VMC, or seek further training or a proficiency check. This approach prioritizes safety and strict adherence to regulatory mandates, ensuring the pilot is legally and competently operating under IFR. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the flight assuming their existing instrument rating is sufficient without verifying recent experience. This directly violates regulations that require pilots to maintain instrument currency to exercise IFR privileges. Another incorrect approach is to rationalize that the weather is just barely IMC and that they can push through it, implying a disregard for the established safety margins and the clear definition of IMC. This demonstrates a failure to understand that IMC requires specific qualifications and currency, regardless of perceived severity. A further incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the aircraft's advanced avionics to compensate for a lack of personal currency, as regulations place the responsibility for maintaining proficiency on the pilot, not the equipment. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic risk assessment. Pilots should first consult the relevant regulations, e.g., FAR Part 61 in the U.S., to understand the precise privileges and limitations of their rating and the currency requirements. They should then honestly assess their personal proficiency and recent flight experience against these requirements. If any doubt exists, the pilot should consult with a certified flight instructor, CFI, or examiner. The decision-making process should always prioritize safety and regulatory compliance over personal convenience or perceived urgency.